Good morning, students of class 9. Let's continue our history lesson. Peasants and farmers. In our previous class, we have talked about the enclosures took place beyond the cultivated land. So, every villager, they used to get various plots of land, a mixture of various plots, good and bad land. They had a system there in England, in the countryside of England. So, after the enclosure, the farmers, they used to keep their good breed of sheep for wool production. And during the 16th century, we have talked about that enclosures took place on the common land. The peasants who depended on from the common lands, the peasants who depended on the common lands, they were driven away from those lands, and they had nowhere to go, and they find it very difficult to survive. So now let's carry on about this. There are 3 points and the next paragraph starts. In some part of England, open fields beyond the cultivated areas around the village, open fields and common lands were enclosed by rich farmers for wool production. Now 2 things you have to remember. During 16th century, enclosures took place for wool production. But during 18th century, the enclosure again took place beyond, further. Enclosure took place for grain production. Now that we will talk about. Farmers, common lands were enclosed by rich farmers for wool production during 16th century. This thing you remember. Now here, between 1750 and 1850, 100 years we will talk about. Between 1750 to 1850, 6 million acres, very big area, 6 million acre of land was enclosed. The common lands were taken over by the rich farmers and landlords. The British government passed 4,000 acts legalizing these enclosures. The government supported these enclosures. The people who enclosed the land, the government supported them because the rich farmers, they used to pay heavy taxes. The government was influenced by these rich farmers. Rich farmers were powerful because they had the money, they were very rich. So, here is a question that arises. Why the government passed 400 acts legalizing these enclosures? Actually, it was against the poor peasants. Poor peasants survive on these lands. But the government supported the rich farmers. There must be some reason, because the government was influenced by these rich farmers. The rich farmers paid the taxes and the government supported their actions because they were powerful and ignored the peasants. The peasants were ignored. Government never thought about the poor peasants and the small farmers, who most of the time they depended on these common lands for survival, for hunting, for gathering fodder, for gathering wild roots we have talked about, for fuel, wood and all. Even they have constructed a small huts to live in the common lands. But they were driven away. From 16th century, they were driven away further. The land were enclosed. And during the 18th century, again they were driven further. More lands were enclosed by the rich farmers. So now, these poor peasants were ignored by the government and passed 4,000 acts legalizing this enclosure. And the poor peasants who were dependent on common lands for survival, they were pushed further. They were driven out from that land. So now here, that is the thing. 1.2, this is 1.2. New demands for grain. Now we'll come to the 18th century now. New demands for food grains. Unlike the 16th century, unlike means not like the 16th century. Unlike the 16th century, enclosures that promoted sheep farming. During 16th century, enclosure promoted sheep farming. The lands were enclosed because the rich farmers, they wanted to produce wool, because there was a demand of wool and they would earn more profit. But during 18th century, the enclosure was for different purpose. But during 18th century, enclosures took place for grain production, for the production of food grains, as there was a demand in the market, high demand of food grains in the market. So the rich farmers, they wanted to earn more profit, so they started enclosing further. These enclosures became a sign of changing times. These enclosures were a sign of changing times. And not only that, not changing time only, but the population of England was also growing, and there was a demand for food grains, not only in England, all over Europe. So the population grew 4 times. During 16th century, the population was very less, but during 18th century, it has grown. It had grown 4 times, 4 folds. So the population expanded rapidly over 4 times. From 16th century till 18th century, the population grew 4 times. So naturally they require more food grains, and there was a great demand. So the rich farmers, the big landlords, they wanted to earn more. So they started enclosing. Before they enclosed for wool production, now they started again enclosing further for grain production. In this way, the peasants suffered more. They were pushed away and away, further away from the good lands, from common lands, and they were pushed to the arid areas. Some of them, they had to leave that area. They were not allowed to stay there. They had no place to go. They became migrants. They left that area and went to the cities and searched for work. They became laborers. They faced hardships. So in our next class, we'll talk about more what happens after that, after 18th century, when the lands were occupied and closed. What happened to those peasants? We'll talk about that, their hardships and difficulties. That's why we'll talk about peasants and farmers. So this is part of the making of a global world. Pastoralists in the modern world. Not making of a global world. Pastoralists in the modern world. So from that part, this is the second part. So peasants. In our previous class, before, pastoralists in the modern world, how pastoralists, they faced the difficulties during colonial period. And after that, we have talked about the pastoralists of Africa, Maasai. Now we'll talk about peasant and farmers in other areas, England, because that was not colonized. That was the original colonizers' country. So what happened during those periods? So we'll talk about peasants and farmers of England. So that's all for today. We'll meet in the next class and carry on our studies further. So till then, study at home, go through the book, and don't waste your time. Be wise enough to use your time and resources properly. That's all for today. Thank you for watching.